Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me tonight. I'm honored to speak to this group. I will have to give you a disclaimer right off the bat. When you talk about North Carolina and the Confederate Navy, to cover that subject thoroughly would take more than the 3 hours that Fred said I had tonight. You did say 3, right? 3 hours? Yeah. Yeah. I think I'd be the only one here talking after about an hour or two. But anyway, what I've done here, it's not a comprehensive history of all North Carolina and all the naval operations, not a whole lot of detailed battles and stuff, but it's just things that I had picked out over the years that I thought were of interest, and I hope you'll find it interesting as well. Okay. All right. As you can see, you've got to kind of understand the context to all that I'm about to tell you. It was not as easy as the Union had it, because they already had a Navy and all this stuff. When you talk about the Confederate Navy, it's like one day they didn't have one, the next day they were supposed to have one. So, but anyway, do want to thank Andrew Dupstott and Charles Hawks, who unfortunately passed on a few years ago. They were very good, or are very good researchers in North Carolina Confederate naval history. Yep. All right. This is when the Confederate Navy was formed, pretty early on in the war. Okay. This man is Stephen Mallory. He was a former Florida U.S. Senator, and he was picked to be the Confederate Secretary of Navy. Now, you might be thinking, what did he have? What kind of background did he have? Well, he was the chairman of the Senate Naval Affairs Committee for the U.S. government for about seven out of his 8 years up there. So he knew a little bit about what was going on. All right, what were his problems? Well, they were not insurmountable, but they were big. Had no merchant ships to speak of, no large skilled workforce for doing shipbuilding and such. Only 2 Navy yards, 3 rolling mills, for making the steel and stuff. No real heavy machine shops. 1 foundry for heavy guns up there at Tredegar. Iron ore had to be acquired, and that was a difficult process. And only 2 steam warships had been built in the South. Now, the Anaconda Plan, I'm sure you're all familiar with that. Winfield Scott decided that the best way to win this war was by strangling the South to death, to cut off all their trade. Well, that included closing the ports at Newbern, Beaufort, and Wilmington. That's 3,500 miles worth of area to try to occupy with naval forces. When you look at, people kind of laugh at the blockade at first, because 5 out of 6 blockaders would go through it, no problem. But you got to remember, 3,500 miles is a long, long way. And even if you've got 400 or 500 ships out there, they may or may not see a blockader coming through. There were 600 ships eventually tied up with the blockade, and they caught a lot of blockade runners, especially toward the end when the anthracite coal, the smokeless, relatively smokeless coal started running out, and they had to use the old bituminous and all that made black smoke. So that was a signal that a ship was coming. Okay. All right, let's look and see what the Navy looked like in April of '61. All right, the North had 90 ships, but only 42 were available. Some of these things had not been kept up. Some of them were off doing different things, but over time, of course, they built their forces back up. They did have 1,500 officers, 7,500 enlisted men. On the contrary, the Confederates had some small converted civil craft, and I'll tell you about some of them here in a minute. I mean, you'd probably laugh at them today, but it's the best they had at the time. Very few officers, but as soon as the officers in the U.S. Navy started resigning to come south, they ended up with more than they could use, and almost no trained enlisted men. They had a lot of people that worked on the coast, fishermen and such, and then they had a lot of what they call landsmen. Anybody know what a landsman is? A landsman is a boy off the farm never even seen a body of water bigger than a pond, and don't know a ship the front from the back. And they put him on ship, and he would do all the menial labor and stuff. We had a lot of landsmen, okay? If you will, read that. This pretty well sums up the reasoning behind why a lot of guys went south. But I like this last part. So I wish it to be understood that no doctrine of the rights of secession nor wish for disunion of the states impel me, but simply because my home is the home of my people in the South, and I could not bear arms against them. That's James Iredell Waddell from North Carolina. All right. I got to looking at this picture. I thought, why is he leaning so much? But then I got to thinking about friends of mine that are Navy veterans, you know. A lot of times they're just standing there doing this, you know. Been on the ships too long, you know. I guess they caught him in a forward lean. But anyway, this is who went south. These guys came out of the U.S. Navy, and that's out of 1,554. That's a pretty significant amount. And like I said, more officers came than they could use eventually, but very few enlisted men left the service and came south, even though some of them were from the South. Why is that? What happens if you leave service without permission? Oh, yeah. Now, officers could resign, as they can now, but not enlisted men. If you jumped ship and went south, you were considered a deserter and could look out for whatever was coming next. Another statement from a North Carolinian, or combination of statements here. All of the U.S. Navy ships that were under command of Southern officers, naval officers, were returned to the U.S. government before the men resigned. People think, well, they probably just stole the ships and took them south. Nope, not a single one was taken south. And so I may be overpowered, but in that event, what will be left of the USS Crusader will not be worth taking. John Newland Maffitt, raised in Cumberland County, North Carolina. Okay. What kind of Navy did we have? We had two types. We had blue water, we had brown water. Blue waters, of course, the ones that go out in the oceans and sail all around. You'll hear more about them in a minute. Then you had the brown water Navy, which is most of what we had. Shallow water Navy. Guarding rivers, inlets, harbors, sounds. If you've ever taken a good hard look at the coast of North Carolina, I mean, it's a nightmare to defend. I mean, and that's what the Confederate Navy was tasked to do. It's a wonder to me they kept the Union forces out as long as they did. So most of our ships then were brown water Navy. All right. Obviously, if you don't have a whole lot to work with, you got to improvise. These are some of the things that the Confederate naval forces did. Of course, they had privateers. These are not actually Confederate Navy ships. These are civilian vessels that armed themselves and got what's called a letter of marque. It's what it is legalized piracy. In other words, it says that you can go out and capture Union ships if you want to and take whatever cargo they got. And it's all legal. That did not last long. Commerce raiders, like the Alabama, the Florida, the Shenandoah, I'll tell you more about them later. They were very successful. Now, as far as warships went, we had ironclads. You've all seen ironclads before. 2 to 4 inches of armor, 10 clads up to a couple of inches. In other words, a partially armored vessel. You had cotton clads, believe it or not, especially on some of the rivers and things. They just took big bales of cotton. Like that at Fort Moultrie, the palmetto logs that they used when the British were fighting them. Cotton bales worked just as well. And then you had what we call the unclads, timber clads. They were just wood, had no armor at all. Now, we had submarines. I thought there was only one submarine, the Hunley. Actually, we'll find out in a minute, there may have been others. We had Davids, and we had the Squib, or Squibs. We're not sure if there were more than one. Anybody know what a davit is? You've probably seen them. It's a cigar-shaped thing. Almost looks like a submarine, but when it was in the water, only the pilot house and all was sticking up and had spar torpedoes sticking out. A squib was like a big motor launch. It made no attempt to try to be submerged or anything. It was just a launch with a big long pole, spar torpedo on it. This thing had a definite tie to Wilmington. Torpedoes. Now, these were not torpedoes like you see in the movies nowadays where the airplanes drop them or subs shoot them out. These were mines. I wish I had time to go into all the different types of mines. You talk about people being creative and coming up with some really, really cool weapons. Get somebody to give you a talk on Civil War torpedoes sometimes. They had contact mines. If you run into them, they explode. They had command detonated mines. They had all the stuff out in Cape Fear River. They had people sitting there with the copper wiring and all this stuff run to shore. And if a Union ship came up and got close enough, hit that wire on the battery and there it went. Floating batteries. These are very unique weapons. I call them weapons. They were defensive weapons. It was almost like you took a cross section of an ironclad, took a knife and just cut it into 2 or 3 different pieces. You would have the slanted front. You'd have the gun port or ports if there were 2 guns. And it looked just like, from the side, it looked like a little bitty miniature ironclad. But the value of these things was you could tow them and anchor them wherever you needed them. It wasn't like a whole ship, but if you needed a couple of guns to cover a river inlet entrance or something, tow one of these bad boys up there and anchor it, and there it was. This fellow here, John Luke Porter, he did a lot of work pre-war for the U.S. Navy on strategies and tactics for how to defend harbors and things, and the floating battery thing was kind of his idea. All right, where were the naval shipyards and stations and activities? Okay, a shipyard is where you build ships. Then you had stations, kind of like a Navy base. You had several different things going on there. And then you had what they called activities. That could have been a lot of different things. It could have been something as simple as a naval rendezvous. Does anybody know what a naval rendezvous is? That's where you did your recruiting. You'd have people come in to join your naval force, and you probably gave them some initial training and such before they got sent down to Charleston for actual shipboard training. But this is where the actual shipyards, mostly shipyards, were. Berry Brothers, right here in Wilmington. If you know where the battleship North Carolina is, that's Berry's shipyard. The battleship is sitting right where Berry's shipyard was. It's where the CSS North Carolina was built, as a matter of fact. Kind of ironic, CSS North Carolina was built and the USS North Carolina sits there now. And also Cassidy's shipyard, that was down at the end of Church Street on the other side of the river. They built the CSS Raleigh. They were not officially a Confederate shipyard, and really Berry Brothers wasn't, but it came to be called the Confederate shipyard. The Ordnance Works in Raleigh. A lot of people don't have a clue what they were doing, but they were doing more ordnance type stuff than anything else. Charlotte Navy Yard. Why in the name of heaven would you have a Navy shipyard in Charlotte? Well, think about the road network, the rail network. It was pretty much protected from raids, whereas all these places on the coast were subject to Union raids. Tell you a little bit more about Charlotte here in a minute, but it was an extremely important post. Whitehall, which is now Seven Springs, they changed the name in 1951. That's where the Noose was built. Fayetteville Naval Ordnance Depot. But you didn't know they ever had a Naval Ordnance Depot in Fayetteville, right on the Cape Fear River. That was in March of 1865 when everybody was retreating. Even the Confederate naval forces were retreating through there. They had just established that, hoping that at some point south of there, they'd be able to hold the Union forces up. Didn't work. So they had to evacuate that pretty soon. I can't even tell you now how many days it was in operation, but it was not long. Halifax, though Edwards Ferry Shipyards, where the Albemarle was built. That's a couple of miles up north of Hamilton. Of course, Kinston had a naval station there. Little Washington had one. I say Little Washington. They like Little Washington, but anyway, it was Washington, North Carolina, not D.C., not the swamp. Tarboro had one briefly, and you have to really dig deeply to find out exactly what went on at these places, why they even got called this. Most of them were not in operation for the full time of the war, and most of these things here came out of records I researched to do my book. So some guy says, well, I was stationed at the Kinston Naval Station, for 2 years or a year or something. So that's where they came from. Okay. All right. How many of you realized that everybody figured, well, Confederates all wore gray, correct? Not in the Navy. There's a tradition in the Navy. Sailors wear blue, very dark blue. It's called navy blue. I don't care what country you're in, which side you were on during the war between the states. Real sailors wear blue. You could see blue-clad Confederate sailors walking the streets of most any town that had a harbor in the South. It caused some anxiety with some people, but somebody made the decision to put, since the Confederate soldiers were in gray, the sailors should be in gray. But it was not well received. That's going against tradition. You don't go against tradition. I should put that slide together. Oh, well, I'll find out who it was. Anyway, so who's ever seen a gray sailor, no matter what nationality he is? But a lot of U.S. Navy uniforms came out of Norfolk. When Norfolk fell to the Confederacy, they had, what the Army would call quartermaster stores there. So they got a lot of good stuff out of Norfolk. But I have a funny feeling a lot of them probably had tailor-mades done by local tailors. But anyway, that was something that a lot of the guys didn't like. It's also interesting to note that as the Confederate Navy grew and needed more and more people, a lot of guys transferred from the Army into the Navy, and they just brought whatever they were wearing. If they were wearing a shell jacket and gray trousers or whatever, that's what they wore. Okay. This is just a sketch. I wish it was in color of what the uniforms looked like. But as I said before, the navy blue did not disappear. In fact, I'll tell you a little anecdote right quick. At the Battle of Averysboro, which took place about just a few miles outside of Irwin, where I live, it was one of the attempts to slow up Sherman, one wing of Sherman's army. I read an account by a Union soldier who was at the battle, and he said at one point, the lines were fairly close together. He said they saw a big long column of guys in blue uniforms in the Confederate lines, marching, taking up position. And of course, they were going to shoot them, but the officer said, no, they're our men. They're in blue uniforms, but they're in the Confederate lines, And when whoever these guys were, when they opened up a volley on them, then they changed their minds. But at any rate, there has been some supposition over years that there were Confederate sailors involved in some of the land battles like Averysboro and Bentonville. And I know for a fact back in the 60s when my father and I were doing metal detecting at Bentonville, we found a small fouled anchor button shaped like that. And you can see where the little clasp had been on the back, a little cuff button or something. So who knows? And they did capture a sailor in Fayetteville on, I believe it was on like the 12th or the 14th or something of March. Okay, I was going to talk to you about the mosquito fleet. This is a picture of the Seabird, little bitty civilian craft that they had put a cannon on. It got sunk in the Pasquotank River. Almost every state that had a coastline had a state navy for a while before the actual Confederate Navy got going good. But obviously they did not last long. All right, so everybody knows about mosquitoes, real small, aggravating little pests. And that's exactly what the mosquito fleet was. Small boats that could weave in and out and just cause all kinds of havoc. It was led by Flag Officer William F. Lynch. 5 small civilian craft with a cannon or 2 mounted on them. Talk about a makeshift naval force, that was it. When Burnside came in '62 to try to land on Roanoke Island, the mosquito fleet met him, and they had a battle. 18th February 62, and then a couple of days after that, they went up the river to Elizabeth City on the 10th and fought. Okay, the first day, Battle of Roanoke, the Mosquito fleet pretty much ran out of ammunition. So Lynch had to withdraw and head to Elizabeth City to try to find ammunition. They talk about not planning ahead, you know. Maybe they were realists and they thought they'll blow us out of the water before we get 2 shots off, so we don't need more than 2 shots. But at any rate, the Mosquito fleet was gone, so 10,000 Union troops landed on Roanoke Island, southern tip. That was probably the first fairly large-scale amphibious operation that the Union did during the war, the first one. Now, a couple of days later at Elizabeth City, 3 out of 5 of these little rascals were either destroyed or captured. But that pretty much brought an end to the Mosquito fleet. They did not accomplish a whole lot, but just like a mosquito, they aggravated the enemy enough to try to buy some time for other forces to get together. All right. Talking about some interesting folks from North Carolina in the naval service, you know, we had at least 6 Tar Heels assigned or on temporary duty aboard the CSS Virginia when it fought the Monitor. J.B. Cunningham from Madison County is said to have piloted the Virginia during the battle. Anybody know where Madison County is? Where is it? Yeah, it's up in the mountains. Confederate sailor out in the mountains. I was surprised how many guys were from out in the mountains and places like that. They wound up in the Confederate Navy. But at any rate, William F. Drake, and this is him here, he was out of Northampton County, which is right on the border with Virginia. He had enlisted in the United Artillery of Norfolk, and he and about 30 others were temporarily assigned to the Virginia for that battle. Why would they go out and get a bunch of land artillerymen to put on a ship? You got it. They only guys knew how to work cannons. And they think he may have been the last survivor of that battle. James M. Sheffield was a landsman. He's buried up at Oakwood in Raleigh. He's one of the estimated 2,800 plus Tar Heel Confederates and Marines. And yes, we did have Confederate Marines. All right, commerce raiders. If anybody was successful in Confederate naval service, it was the commerce raiders. Their mission was simple: destroy or capture merchant ships. They weren't worried about warships. They wanted to cripple the Union economy. They sank, altogether now, they sank or captured 237 vessels worth $19.9 million. That was in 1865 dollars. A dollar then would be about $38 today. So you see how much that cost. That's a heck of a lot. That's just short of $1 billion in shipping. 5% of the entire U.S. merchant ship fleet. Shipping rates and insurance skyrocketed. Now that hurt the northern economy some kind of bad, because you talk about tariffs, everybody's all upset now about Trump wanting to change tariffs. What do you think that did? The stuff just went crazy. All right, some merchant ships, probably not all, but a lot, sought protection by flying foreign flags. So if you're out on the ocean and you're flying, say, a British flag, Confederate raiders aren't going to shoot at you. Now, that don't mean they might pull up beside you and check you, and if they do, you're in deep kimchi. But a lot of them use it to try to slip in and out. It took a lot of ships away from blockade duty trying to chase down these commerce raiders. The merchant fleet, I read one story about it, said it did not fully recover until World War II. You think about the massive shipbuilding that went on in World War II. We had it right here in Wilmington. And that's when the U.S. merchant fleet really got back to the same level of domination it had before or at the early part of the war between the states. Now, it also helped the U.S. government resolve the thorny issue of the rights of belligerency. Does anybody know what that was? Rights of belligerency. Well, let me put it to you this way. Under the U.S. Constitution, if you are tried, let's see, they considered it treason for the South to want to get away and form their own country. So if you were fighting for the Confederacy, you were a traitor. You would be tried for treason under the Constitution. Somebody figured out right pretty soon after the war got going good and all the prisoners started coming in and all this. Wait a minute. How are we going to try each one of these soldiers, each one of these sailors that we capture? It'll take 500 years to try all these people. So they extended the rights of belligerency to the Confederacy so that they could treat them like just regular belligerents, combatants. It was an act of convenience. They claimed that the South never really left the Union, but if so, why did they change the rules? Anyway, it was an interesting question there for a while. Now remember Moffett, he's the guy that was brought up on Lower Little River there in Cumberland County. What's that? But anyway, he's the guy who said he would not turn his ship over, the Crusader, USS Crusader, to the Confederates, even though he was a North Carolinian and was going to go south. But this is what his instructions, the way he interpreted his instructions, and he did a good job at it. Moffett was born at sea. His parents were Irish, and they were immigrants coming into New York, and he actually was brought up until the age of 5 in Connecticut. But his parents were kind of poor, and his uncle, who lived down on Lower Little River in Cumberland County, adopted him and brought him down there to live. His father was kind of an itinerant preacher, but after a while, believe it or not, became the chaplain to the House of Representatives for the Congress of 41-42. All right, what are you going to do with this kid? Put him in the Navy, 13 years old. He spent 29 years in the U.S. Navy. That's a long time. And then the war broke out. Messed his pension up something fierce. Anyway, Confederate career, captain of the Florida, the Albemarle, and a blockade runner called the Owl. He was, after the war, he lived in Wilmington, and this is where he died. In fact, the water taxi that runs did run between the battleship and the main part of town over there was called the Moffett or Maffett, depends on how you want to pronounce it. I've heard it both ways. All right, so what did the Florida accomplish? Well, one thing, they went right up within 50 miles of New York City, sailing off the waters of New York City. He captured 37 ships in 7 months. He captured 2 Union vessels, the Tacony and the Clarence, armed them and made little mini raiders out of them. They took an additional 23 ships. So there's that one ship and 2 small ones accounted for 60 merchant vessels, $4 million worth of shipping. That was second in rank to of the merchants, of the commerce raiders. Now, they put into port in Brazil for some reason. I can't remember what it was, coal or something. Well, a U.S. ship went in and captured the Florida in a neutral port. Highly against the law. Maritime law, international maritime law says, you can't do that. Even a judge in a U.S. court ordered the Union Navy to take that ship back to Brazil and turn it back over to the Confederates, because it was against U.S. law to do that. Well, unfortunately, it was rammed and sunk under suspicious circumstances at Hampton Roads in 1864. Accidents will happen, right? Yeah, right. Okay. Okay. Here's another North Carolinian that became very famous in naval lore. Born in Pittsburgh in Chatham County. That's a good long ways from the Blue Water too. He commanded the Shenandoah, entered the Navy when he was 16. He had a limp, pre-war duel. He was very quick-tempered, but he was described as very chivalrous. So he might get mad at you and challenge you to a duel and kill you, but he'd apologize afterwards. But anyway, one of the funniest things about the Shenandoah said today, one of the ships he captured, there was a lady traveling on there and said, wanted to know, could she take her private possessions off the ship before he sank it? And he said, yes, ma'am, you certainly may, very chivalrous. And he let her take everything but a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which he dropped into the ocean. I guess it was an accident. Now, this is where they went, Northern Pacific Indian Ocean, and the Bering Sea and Arctic waters. So they spent a lot of time out here. And what do you think, what kind of Union shipping would have been out in that kind of water? Whalers, yes. Whaling, whale oil was extremely valuable at the time. You burned it in lamps, you use it in machinery and all kinds of things. So in 58,000 miles of travel in 13 months, he sank or bonded 38 ships valued at 1.4 million, mostly whalers. Now, what is bonding of a ship? Sinking a ship is obvious. But if he captured a ship and bonded it, what was that? Huh?
Effectively, it belonged to the Confederacy, and for them to get it back, they would have to pay.
Yes, sir. Held it for ransom. And they usually pay it. All right. He had so many prisoners, he literally had to put them in whale boats and tie them to a rope and pull them behind his ship. That he had nowhere on his ship to put so many. And he wasn't going to leave them out there to drown, you know. I'm going to be honest with you, I'm not sure. Yeah, probably the nearest neutral port. That would have been the safe thing to do. But it's the only Confederate ship to circumnavigate the globe and fired the last shots of the war between the states. And this is her. That is the Shenandoah. We actually have at the State Archives, I think it's volume 2 of the logbook of the Shenandoah. She captured the Abigail, which was a merchant ship, had several dozen barrels of corn whiskey, you know, to be used for medical purposes. And it was said it took 3 working parties 2 days to transfer that cargo. Not a dozen sober men on board except the prisoners. You know, odd sailors don't drink. All right. The last Raider Commission, October of '64, only ship, like I said, to circumnavigate the globe. The best day she ever had was June the 28th of 1865. Captured 10 whaling ships, burned 8, and bonded 2. Only problem was the war was over. 38 ships he captured, 25 after the war ended. Now, I have heard various stories that said he did not know that the war was over. How would he know? He's way out there in the Baltic or the Bering Sea or somewhere. But I think they said he found a newspaper from a Boston newspaper or something that made reference to Lee's surrender. But he didn't really believe it. But I think he got up with a British ship somehow, and they said, "Oh yeah, you're in deep doo-doo," as they say. So anyway, after he found out that the wars had been over for a good while, he disarmed his ship, got rid of all his cannons, and sailed 17,000 miles to Liverpool, England. Now, why would he disarm his ship and then sail to Liverpool instead of just coming back to the States? How was he going to prove that he did not know the war was over and he wasn't just sinking ships for the fun of it? All right. It was the last Confederate unit to lower the Confederate flag, and that was on November the 5th, 1865. Technically, I'd say that was the actual end of the war between the states. That's when the last combat unit surrendered. All right. Let's talk about ironclads built in North Carolina. The CSS North Carolina, CSS Neuse, CSS Albemarle, and CSS Raleigh. And you can see the commissioning dates. Does anybody know the difference between launching date and commission date? Come on, there got to be some sailors in here. Anybody in here been in the Navy? What's the difference?
The launch is when it leaves the dry dock, and the commission is when it's
ready for war. Exactly right. Once it hits the water, it's been launched. It might take several weeks or months to get it outfitted so that it can actually go out and do its mission. So these are the commissioning dates, as near as I could find, for these ships. All right. Now, there were a lot of problems, common problems, that whether you were building ironclads in North Carolina or Virginia or wherever, several problems that you were all, you weren't going to be able to get around. The shortage of iron and iron production, Army control of the railroads. Now, number one, the South did not have anywhere near the railroad mileage that the North had to begin with. But then you put the Army in charge of running the railroads. Army couldn't have cared less about Navy. If Navy said, we have got to get this stuff to wherever, to Wilmington or something within the next 2 days, you'd have probably gotten a, okay, whatever, you know, and it might get there in 2 or 3 months. So the Army and Navy did not cooperate. They didn't share their toys nicely. A lot of other supplies, nautical type supplies, they couldn't get. Always underpowered engines. They were taking them off of old tugboats, anything they could get. You put several tons of iron plate or steel plating on a ship, you're going to have a powerful engine to move that thing. And unfortunately, we didn't have them. Did not have them. Very limited shipyards, skilled labor. Not that many people knew how to build ships. And then if you got them built, where were you going to get the sailors? Like I said, you had a bunch of old country boys that used to work in the plow in the field. They could be landsmen, but they didn't know. They didn't, as they say, know the ropes. You know, all the ropes that are on a ship. That's what they call knowing the ropes. They had no clue. And the enemy knew the location of every construction site. There were no secrets during that war. I mean, the confounded newspapers would print exactly what. Oh, up at a cornfield at Edwards Ferry, they're building a great big ram up there. You know. Well, the North got those papers too. About as bad as nowadays. So nothing was a secret. All right. The North Carolina, I call her the hard luck ironclad. She was plagued by many construction problems. You can see worker shortage, typhoid epidemic. It was built out of green lumber, which came back to haunt her. No copper to line the hull. Why do you need copper to line a wooden ship's hull?
Worms.
Torpedo worms, yes, and other things. They'll bore holes right through it. So it was launched in October 63, placed off of Southport port mostly as a floating battery because the pumps could not pump fast enough to keep the water out of the ship. It was seeping in so fast the pumps couldn't even hardly keep it out. So it basically became a floating battery to guard the mouth of the Cape Fear. Of course, it went down. It just became hopeless. They couldn't do anything with it. That's when it went down off of Smithville, which is now Southport. Warping lumber. Didn't have time to let the lumber dry out. And torpedo worms. In 1995, a merchant ship was coming up the river and decided to anchor down there. They dropped a 15,000-pound anchor on what was left of North Carolina, just obliterated it. The noose, we have a letter in the archives from a Virginia naval officer that was assigned to the noose to help oversee construction and all this. He referred to it in his letters as the CSS nuisance. And the people that were being recruited to be the crew, he referred to them as a lot of long, lank tar heels. Just a whole bunch of tall, skinny farm boys, you know. That's all they had. Okay. It was supposed to be used for in inland waterway there. Ran aground and spent a month. When it went down the river to try to get into action, it got grounded on a bar and, of course, had to sit there till it could get off. They had to burn it in March of 65 to keep it from falling into Union hands. It did have 2 Brook rifles on it, so it had some decent armor. Yes, sir. Every one of those ships had a different number of crew. I'm going to say probably somewhere between 150 and 180, just ballpark. But it just, like I said, just,
It's a lot more than we.
oh yeah. Well, everything you did on there pretty much had to be done by hand. It wasn't like on a ship nowadays, you know, where you got loading machines and all this, it's all hand. Okay. All right. How many of you have seen the CSS Noose II? The original Noose was recovered. And that's what was left of it right there. I got a friend that lives there, and actually lives in Greenville. But he said when they were boys, they used to go out there and pull stuff off of that ship. Yeah, it was right there in the river, low tide. It stuck out. So, recovered in 63. It's on display now at Kinston. If you've not been over to see the CSS Noose Museum, it's worth driving over to see. It's on the National Register. But the thing that's really impressive is this. This is a full-size replica of the CSS News. Built with private funds, volunteers, took several years to build, but there's nothing like, I can't remember is it Queen Street? I can't remember what, there's nothing like driving on that street going to the museum and all of a sudden here's a full-size Confederate gunboat sitting on the corner of a lot. And you can actually go in it. They have times when you can go in. Okay. Tell them I'm not here. If it's my wife, tell her I am here. Okay, the Neustadt II full-scale replica cost, that thing was not cheap. That thing was not cheap at all. It's the only known full-scale replica of an ironclad. They have a half-scale replica of the Albemarle down at Plymouth, but it doesn't even compare to this. Now, when the Albemarle was built, Edwards Ferry, literally in the edge of a cornfield, Halifax County, they put it under the direction of a 19-year-old soldier named Gilbert Elliott. Now, Gilbert was something of an inventor and sort of a scientist. Obviously knew what he was doing because they got one of the most famous and effective ironclads of the entire war built with next to nothing. There was no shipyard or anything. They pulled that thing up out of the water and there it was. Okay, it mounted 2 Brooke rifle cannon and it twice defeated U.S. Navy ships. Another North Carolinian, he was born in Beaufort. James Wallace Cook. He was actually the highest ranking Confederate naval officer we had. He entered the Navy in 28, 33 years of Navy service, and then 4 years of Confederate Navy service. 37 years he put into naval service. He did command the Albemarle, and unfortunately he died in Portsmouth in 1869. So he died very soon after the war ended. All right, Battle of Plymouth, April of 1864. The Albemarle sank the USS Southfield and damaged the USS Miami. They had them chained together for some strange reason. So the Southfield went down. It's lucky it didn't take the Miami with it. But remember this, the captain of the Miami, the one that stayed afloat but was damaged, Captain Charles W. Flusser. He was killed in this action, but remember that. Okay, action in Albemarle Sound, May 5th, 1864. The Albemarle by itself faced 7 Union gunboats, 3 of which were 3 times her size, 60 guns against 2. 557 shells were fired at her. That is the smokestack from the original Albemarle. I can remember the old Hall of History up in Raleigh before they got the big museum.
Were any of those 7 gunboats ironclads, or were they all?
I think they were. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if they were or not. It says gunboats. My reference. I'm figuring it may not have been ironclads. If there'd been that many, they'd probably tried to ram her and sink her, but a regular gunboat wouldn't have done that. But that thing right there was fascinating. I remember as a little boy going up there to the Hall of History. Of course, you could walk right up and touch it and everything. But look at all those holes in it. 557 shells will cause some damage. But why was it so significant, all these holes in the smokestack? What did that do to the ship?
Like a draft.
There you go. You lose your draft, you lose your speed. That's what defeated the Albemarle, all those holes in the smokestack. It wasn't all these guns. But anyway, let's see. Okay, all of you know the story of William B. Cushing, a U.S. Navy guy that got on a motor launch, very much like a squib, and came in and sunk the Albemarle with a spar torpedo. Flusser, remember the guy Flusser? He was a good friend of Cushing. So Cushing was kind of on a vendetta to get even for his friend. So that was the date that she met her demise. This is a picture of the actual Albemarle after it was raised. And it was sold for scrap in 1867. Sold for $3,200. Construction costs almost $80,000. Somebody got a good deal. Let's see, Raleigh. Yeah, the Raleigh was the latest one, or last one actually commissioned, April of 64. On May 5th of 64, she fought 6 ships at one time. Unfortunately, when she was going, I I can't remember if she was going down the Cape Fear or coming back up. Again, hit a sandbar, and the tide was going out. The captain thought they'd be okay. Unfortunately, it broke her back. All the weight, all that armor and stuff, and those guns. They did salvage the iron plating. It had 4 6-inch rifled cannon. Rifled cannon were far more effective than smoothbore cannon. You could shoot at an ironclad all day with round balls, and it put dents in, and that's about it. But a rifled cannon, man, they'd do some damage. 188-man crew, 150 feet long. East Carolina dive people investigated that wreck in 94. Now, here's one that's very interesting to the people, should be to the people of Wilmington. This was on the work, or in the works, or on the stocks, as they say, in Wilmington, being built when the war ended. Now, you notice this is not an ironclad, but it has armored turrets. It has 2 armored turrets. This was a revolutionary design for a warship. In fact, the British used some ships very similar to this in World War I. 224 feet long. Remember, I said the Albemarle was a heck of a ship, and it was 150 feet long. This joker was long. 2 guns, probably Brook rifles. See, the thing was, you didn't need a gun at every port. You just needed one, because you could pull the gun back. If somebody attacks you over here, you pull the gun back, fire at them. If somebody shoots at you from the stern, you shoot at them. Kept them from having to have so many guns. But it was in the process of being built in Wilmington, but unfortunately was destroyed on the stocks. It was still on land being built in January of '65. Yeah. No, Confederates when they were withdrawing, I think. Yeah. Now, the reason I bring this up is I've always kind of admired these powder boys and what they call powder monkeys. You notice the official age for enlisting in the Navy was 13. That's pretty young. But they had kids as young as 9 or 10 that did this job. Now, both navies used these kids because they were small, nimble, they were quick, they could dodge between guns firing and all this stuff. It was their job to go down below the decks, get another charge of powder, because it came in a canvas type bag. They had to run it up to whatever gun they were serving, give it to them, go back and get another one. Now, if anything had happened, a flash fire or a spark in the wrong place, they'd have been vaporized. This gentleman right here, Benjamin H. Gray, was from Bertie County. He is an African American. He enlisted at the age of 12 as a powder boy. He was on the Albemarle when it was blown up. He was actually on it. A lot of people say, well, no, he couldn't have been on it because he was black. Yeah, he was. You'd be surprised how many blacks served in Confederate service. And not all of them forced. I remember I had a lady that worked across the hall from me. We were talking about this very thing. And so I was trying to explain to her, because we got pension records in the state archives in Raleigh where these guys got, and their widows got pensions for serving. They wouldn't have gotten a pension if they hadn't served. And she said, well, that really doesn't count because they were forced to go. Okay. No. So you're telling me that the guys who got drafted and sent to Vietnam, their service didn't count? Oh, well, yeah, that's what I thought. But anyway, he became a minister after the war, and after he died, his wife continued to get a pension, well on into the 1900s, I think. Okay, the underwriter. That was kind of a special ops thing. John Taylor Wood was a lieutenant in the Navy and a colonel in the cavalry, believe it or not. He was the grandson of President Zachary Taylor and the nephew of Jefferson Davis. But he was quite a guy. He came up with a plan to go up the river, up the Neuse, and there was a Union ship called the Underwriter, and they were going to capture that thing and make off with it. So he put the word out, and they sent sailors from Richmond, from Savannah, from Charleston, several places up to rendezvous, and they put them in boats. These 14 boats, they brought them down by train, believe it or not. Put all these guys in there, and they actually captured the ship February 2nd of '64 in some really bloody hand-to-hand fighting. But unfortunately, they had let the fires go down. It was a steamer. You have to have a fire to have steam, and they couldn't move it. So they had to just destroy it in place. But there were 5 Confederates and 9 Union casualties, including the underwriter's commanding officer. The Hunley, you've all heard of the submarine Hunley. The Hunley was a good idea, but I think it was a little before its time technologically. 3 different crews that manned that ship died. The first crew, how many people on it? 9 people on it. The first crew, when it went down, there was a leak, and 2 or 3 of them were able to get out. The rest of them drowned right where they were sitting. The second crew, I think it went down, and none of them survived. They were doing it right next to the CSS Indian Chief, which was a training vessel in Charleston. The new guys coming in, they taught them the ropes, taught them how to be a sailor. So they were doing this right beside the Indian Chief. So these guys were manning the rails watching as this thing goes down, and these guys drown. And they came up, okay, we need a second crew. Okay, I'll go. All right, we need a third crew. These guys volunteered. But anyway, it was the first sub to sink a warship, the Housatonic, February 17th, 1964. I actually went down when they did the burial of the third crew when they found them. This guy right here was a North Carolinian. He was on the third crew. In fact, that thing was recovered. This is James A. Wicks from North Carolina. He was on the third crew of the Hunley. He was aboard it when they sank the Cumberland. He was on the Cumberland when it was sunk by the Virginia. He was at Hampton Roads, the monitoring the Virginia. He got off and swam to shore. He was one of the few enlisted men that just jumped ship and came and joined the Confederate Navy. He traveled from Charleston. He was in the detachment from Charleston that came up to go on the underwriter mission. Sadly, 16 days later, he drowned on the third crew of the Hunley. Okay. Blockade runners. There's nothing any more romanticized about the war than blockade runners. There's Rhett Butler and Scarlett O'Hara. But anyway, the truth of it is, these things did not make trips all the way across the ocean to England or France and all the way back. What they did was to meet the goods from neutral ships and such in one of the harbors, Havana, Nassau, somewhere Bermuda. Then they would offload the goods, put it on a blockade runner, and the blockade runner would make the run in. They had to be shallow, fast, shallow draft, so you didn't draw a lot of water, get into low places. They had a long, low profile. Some of these things are amazing. If you ever look at pictures of these things, they put some thought into building them. Smokeless coal was important. And like I said, by the end of the war, you couldn't get the anthracite, so it was pretty dangerous. They painted them gray, or like battleship gray, or dull white, so they would fit in more with the ocean. Half of what you brought in had to be military cargo, but the other half you could sell to people. And that's why these guys made so much money, because they had stuff that you couldn't find in the South. There were about 300 blockade runners, made 1,000 or so trips. And believe it or not, a lot of British naval officers would take leave to command a blockade runner, because you could make more on one trip than they'd probably make in 20 years serving in the British Navy. So why would you not do it? And just as an example, like I said, there were bunches of them, but this was called the Letter Rip. That's her right there. As soon as it made its first trip into Wilmington, its name was changed to the Wando, and I'm not sure why. It was built in Scotland as a ferry between Ireland and Scotland, but it actually got purchased and turned into a blockade runner. But anyway, one of its later trips, it was captured outbound from Wilmington, and the U.S. renamed it the Wando. They, rather than destroy these ships, the Union Navy was smart. They said, why should we burn these things? If we can just put a crew of our own men on them, that becomes another blockading vessel. So that was pretty smart, I thought. Okay, this was North Carolina's own blockade runner. The state actually had a blockade runner of its own. This is the Advance. It was built as the Lord Clyde in Greenock, Scotland, side wheel steamer. And you see it as Advance, and you can see it as Advance. Vance was our governor during the war. So either name is appropriate. it was one of the most successful blockade runners of all time. Over 20 voyages before it got captured off of Wilmington in September of '64. Yes, we had Confederate States Marines. Anybody in here a Marine veteran? I'm sorry. No, this is for you. This is for you. That's what the Confederate Marine Corps was authorized, 1,026 men. That's about the same as a regular infantry regiment in the Army. So it was a very small force. By October of '64, they only had 539 men. They served guard detachments on land. They were gun crews on warships. I'm going to have words with whoever put these slides together. And they were also served as sharpshooters when the ships would come together and actually have battles. Warships were a very special kind of ship. No, they had a whole crew of guys that were kind of like, but anyway, there were 93 North Carolinians in the Confederate States Marine Corps, believe it or not. I have a record of where a recruiting officer from the Marine Corps came up to Camp Holmes, which was a camp of instruction in Raleigh, and said, I need 30 bodies. You up to 30, and out they went. Talk a little bit more about that in a minute. This is Francis Hawks Cameron right here. He was the only, well, not really the only. He was the North Carolinian that was an officer in the Confederate States Marine Corps from Hillsborough. He was in the Coast Survey, U.S. Coast Survey Act before the war, and that's his Coast Survey uniform, blue. And he put those French foil things on there after he got in the Confederate Marine Corps. He was also the Adjutant General of North Carolina from 1893 to '96. This is Henry Hunter Bowen, Washington County. He is one of the 30 men that got drafted into the Confederate Marine Corps. One of the other guys was a brother, and I think another one was a cousin. But anyway, they were taken in '64. He wrote 18, well, there are 18 letters, 17 from Henry and one from his brother George W. that was written on the back of one of Henry's. These are in the archives. A fellow I knew named John Oden that lived in Bath, North Carolina. He had these letters, found them at a yard sale or something, but they actually tied into his family. So it was very fortunate. He and I were trying to get together on donating them to the archives or transcribing them and publishing them or something, but he had a heart attack and died. Well, being the ghoulish type that I am, I waited about 6 months and I called his wife and said, you still got those letters that John was going to donate to the archive? She said, yeah, oh yeah, I still want to do it. And I said, but I'd like to get an appraisal on them, just for tax purposes. Well, state archives or museum, anybody, you are not allowed to give an appraisal on something, even if you know what it's worth. You can't tell them. You have to do a civilian person. I just happened to know a guy there in Raleigh that did appraisals. Anyway, this was the largest known collection of enlisted Confederate Marine correspondence known to exist anywhere. Those 18 letters. And they are fascinating to read. You can find them online now. But anyway, the neatest thing about it was in one of his letters, one of the early letters to his wife, it was written from Charleston. He wrote they were going to be Marines. That's how he spelled it, Marines. And they say we'll have the finest clothing and the best to eat. And nothing, yeah, I mean, nothing changes. Yeah, you can trust me. Come on in. Okay. All right, this is the breakdown of officers from North Carolina that served in the Confederate Navy and Confederate Marine Corps. There was one, of course, Hawks, Cameron, but there were actually two. There was a guy born in North Carolina, but he was raised in South Carolina. He was kind of young when he left. But of all states, there were only 702 officers, Confederate Navy and Marines. 48 of these had been in the U.S. Navy before and resigned and went south. And there were 48 total North Carolina Navy and Marine officers. I'm sorry? Can you go back one?
What is a fastest or
there were several different levels. It's not like today, you're just a midshipman, and then all of a sudden you get a commission. If you were past midshipman, that meant that you had met all the qualifications, you were ready to be commissioned as somebody above you died. basically. In other words, it had to be a slot. So there were a lot of guys that were, I mean, there were guys who were past midshipmen up in their 30s. You know, they'd been hanging around for a while. It was just their system. Okay. Sailor soldiers and naval infantry. Once Sherman's march began, the guys who had been in Savannah, the naval personnel, of course, they hightailed it north. They bypassed Charleston, but that outflanked Charleston. So that naval contingent headed north. Wilmington, same thing. They headed north. They became infantrymen. Commodore John Randolph Tucker formed a naval brigade. It was about the size of a depleted regiment. He went anywhere from 300 or 400 guys up to 600 at one time. But anyway, and Admiral Raphael Sims formed another naval unit. But the ones that had most of our guys in it were with Tucker. He moved up to Richmond, gathering displaced naval personnel as he went. He was in Fayetteville, believe it or not, on February 27th, but they moved on. They went to Drury's Bluff, which was a very key battery position on the James River. If you couldn't get by Drury's Bluff to get into Richmond, if you were on a ship, you'd get blown up. But that was the Confederate Marine Corps headquarters, and also, like I said, a key naval battery. Now, once Lee broke out from the Richmond-Petersburg line, they headed west. Tucker did not know what was going on. He didn't know they were going to be leaving. He just noticed that there was a lot of fires in Richmond. And after a while, he got to put two and two together and said, oh, heck, we got to get out of here. So he took his guys, his web-footed infantry, and they became the rear guard of Ewell's Corps. Now, the Army guys, you know, Army and Navy always joke about each other. The Army guys nicknamed the Navy sailors aye-ayes. Why'd they do that? Yeah, when you're giving an order, you say, aye, aye, sir. You don't say, yes, sir. You say, aye, aye, sir. So it was kind of funny to them. These guys were walking around saying, aye, aye. Okay. At the Battle of Sailor's Creek, and I've always thought that was ironic since sailors took a big part, the 6th of April, 65, they were surrounded. He was rear guard, like I said, and he was surrounded by 6 Union divisions. Now, at that time, he had about 300 to 400 men. Union was getting ready to charge, and Tucker gave the order, prepare to repel boarders. Navy. Yep. I mean, they did. I tell you, these guys, it's amazing. Y'all ought to make a movie about these guys. They took on, when they were surrounded, and after they repelled that first charge, he realized, wait a minute, we're surrounded. We got to get out of here. Surrendering was not even in his vocabulary. So they charged. You can imagine what these guys thought. Here come these guys with muskets and saber, naval cutlasses and dressed funny. They went through the 37th Massachusetts, just about decimated that regiment. And then the 2nd Rhode Island happened to be back there, and they went into them and just about got rid of all of them. But he also realized, he finally received word that Ewell had been totally surrounded and surrendered, and he didn't want to waste the lives of his men. Afterwards, he found out from some Union commanders, they were convinced they were fighting at least 2,000 troops because these guys fought so ferociously. In fact, the Union officer that took Tucker's sword during the surrender later returned it to him out of respect for how well his men had fought. And that statement right there says it all. Robert E. Lee's army was one of the best, toughest has ever been on the face of the earth. And had they had the same equipment and access to recruits and all, there's no telling what would happen. But those sailors, those shipless sailors, fought as well, in fact, better than some of the troops that Lee had in his army. All right. Did Chris come? Chris Fondle?
There was an issue at home.
Oh, okay. Anyway. Well, good. He can't correct me on all this. I've known Chris for years. Anyway, you know who Chris Fondle is. He says there was very strong circumstantial evidence that not one, but 2 submarines were built in Wilmington. One of them, unfortunately, was destroyed when they had a big cotton fire in April '64. And by some accounts, the other was scuttled at Point Peter. You know where that is, confluence of the Northeast Cape Fear and Cape Fear. And I asked him one time, I said, well, wow, that's great. Why don't we get some people, go dive down there and find that thing? He says, there's so much junk at the confluence of those rivers Everything in the world that's ever sunk or whatever is piled up in there, so you'd never find it. So anyway, possibly there is a Confederate submarine buried under the trash in Point Peter. But he firmly believes that Berry Brothers built at least one submarine, and one David, the General Whiting, Whiting was in command here, and they assembled the Squib, the one I told you was a big, long, whaleboat-looking thing with a spar torpedo. When they sent the pieces down, I think from Richmond, they assembled it here in Wilmington, probably at Berry's shipyard. Let's see, and it was scuttled, and as were several other ships. When the Union started coming up the river, there was nowhere to take them, so they had to destroy them. Okay. Charlotte Navy Yard, I told you I'd tell you a little bit more about that. The machinery came from Norfolk in '62 once the Confederates captured it. It was in downtown Charlotte on Trade Street. Now, used to, and I've been there and seen it, these plaques, this plaque was right there on the side of a building. It was not an old building, but it marked where the Confederate States Navy Yard was. I heard recently that the forces of political correctness tore it down or something. But anyway, there's a historic marker. Had 1,500 men and boys employed there, and they produced nearly all the propellers, propeller shafts, anchors, later ordnance for gun carriages, parts for boilers, and after about 63 or so, all the shot and shell for the ships at Charleston and Savannah. Talk about an important place for the Navy, this was. It was possibly partially burned in '64, I can't remember where that came from, but they think there was a big fire there. It remained in operation until April of '65, right to the very end. And it was rebuilt and operated as a civilian facility up into the 1950s and 60s. Fort Fisher. Fort Fisher opened with a bang, quite literally. The Union Navy sitting offshore said, why don't we just blow that fort up? So they took the USS Louisiana, packed it as full of gunpowder as they could possibly get it, and sent it sailing off toward the beach. That thing was going to hit the beach, blow up, and just disintegrate Fort Fisher. Unfortunately, it went off a little early, and the only thing it did was disturb the sleep of the Confederates who were trying to get a bit of shut-eye. So next they decided, well, if we can't blow it up with a ship, we'll just shell it to pieces. 10,000 shells they fired at the first battle of Fort Fisher. Most of the damage was repaired with shovels. That's the advantage of an earthen fort. They can blow your parapets all to pieces. You get a working party out there, shovel the dirt back, and then go back and go sleep. Now, the second battle was a different thing. They had a massive pre-invasion shelling, and then they conducted a humongous amphibious operation that was not equaled until D-Day in 1944. Sailors, soldiers, Marines, everybody they could find. There was a lot of fierce fighting. Have you had a talk on this from Chris? Well, you already know what all went on then. But the garrison was outgunned, outnumbered, had to give up. The last to fall, of course, was Battery Buchanan, way down on the end there. And it was a great big mound of dirt that they had built. Once the Raleigh and the North Carolina had sunk and were no longer able to guard the entrance to the river, they built this huge amount of dirt and put guns on it. And it was totally manned by naval personnel. So once he saw that the main fort had fallen, it was only a matter of time before they came and got him. So he loaded his guys up on some boats, and they rowed across the river to Fort Anderson, where they very, very briefly manned batteries Mears and Campbell before they marched on northward. All right, end of the war. The Navy, U.S. Navy, 52,000 people in the U.S. Navy, 6,000 officers, 46,000 enlisted men, over 700 ships. We only got 295 ships today. That shows you the magnitude of the Navy during the war between the states. Over 600 ships were involved at one time or another in performing blockade duty. The Confederacy, 5,200 men, outnumbered 10 to 1. So they went from absolutely no ships to 130, which included about 12 true ironclads that were actually launched and commissioned. Now, you'll find disagreements among naval historians as to how many ironclads there were, how many were, you could spend all day doing that. But my criteria was a ship that was actually launched, it went into commission, and actually got into service. So that was about 12 or so. Conclusion, they did the best they could with what they had. They were always under strength, always lacking materials. About 2,800 plus North Carolinians were either in the Navy or the Marines. There were a lot of transfers from the Army to the Navy and from the Navy to the Army. I have a separate talk on stuff I found out in the process of writing my book, some hilarious stuff. Guys transferring back and forth. Some of them did it 3 and 4 times. But anyway, the Navy was always a low priority for the Confederate government. I told you about the railroad fiasco. But yet they were expected to guard all these sounds and rivers and inlets and everything. And had they been able to do that, war might have been a whole different ball game in North Carolina. But they did give a very good account of themselves in every engagement they were in. Even the mosquito flu, as almost laughable as that was, going up against a regular Union warship, they accomplished what they had to do. And that is basically it. Questions, comments? Yes, sir. What? Don't applaud, just throw money. Yes, sir.
So you said these ships were like 150, 200 feet long, and they had a crew of 288.
Well, 188 was the highest I saw.
How do they fit that number of people on this ship?
They were crowded. They were crowded. The Confederate rams were built a lot like the British build their warships, at least used to. They built the ship for the guns and all the stuff that you had to have for guns. The crew was a secondary priority. I have a friend of mine that was on some of these things for a while. But he said you couldn't even hardly walk on the decks. Guys were sleeping on the deck on these British ships. So wherever they could find a place to curl up, that's where they went. So
The Confederate Raiders, the Florida, Shenandoah, what was the third one? Shenandoah.
Florida, Shenandoah, and Alabama.
Alabama. How and when were they acquired?
Mostly by hook or crook. You couldn't technically order a ship from France or Great Britain and say, we're going to use this as a warship or a commerce raider, international law and all that. Most of them were built as, ferry steamers or whatever, some other name, until the Confederate agents got it and sailed it out in international waters. Then it all of a sudden got reconfigured and everything into a warship. But no, if Great Britain had backed the Confederacy openly, because they did it kind of under the table, but because of slavery, they couldn't really come right out and support it. But if they had openly supported the Confederacy, it's just like France when they supported George Washington. That made all the difference in the world. All the difference in the world. We might have a Confederate flag flying out here instead of a Union flag. Who knows? Yes, sir.
Thank you for the great presentation.
Thank you.
I'm glad I forgot which one it was right off Southport. It was
North
by the anchor.
North Carolina.
Pieces of that.
I don't know. I'm sure there are pieces of it around because people who find out where the thing. At one time, I was told you could actually see part of it when the water was real low, but I suspect that thing's been dived on many, many times, and everything that can be taken off is taken off. But
there's a model of the North
yeah,
Carolina.
yeah, yeah. I always thought it, like I said before, so ironic that where the Confederate ram North Carolina was built is right where our battleship North Carolina from World War II is now. So you can stand on the deck of the North Carolina and look over and see brickwork and stuff in the water from Berry's shipyard. Sure can. Oh yeah. Yep. A little shameless. What can I say?
So much, Si.
Yeah.
That was amazing.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Speaking of,
Oh, look at that.
this is for you. We have an
Oh.
amazing artist, Jim Horton, who's a member of our roundtable.
Wow. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Yeah. Yeah. Oh. Yeah. But if any of you are interested in if you, you can look at the books if you want to. I think I got like 6. But if you just want to thumb through them and see what's in there, the volume 22 of the North Carolina Troop Series is the Naval volume that has just been out a few months. It's an excellent volume. It really is. There's some really good information in there. In fact, if you want a good, concise story of naval operations in North Carolina, the front part of that book's dedicated to that. Yes, sir.
What you hiding under that trash bag?
What?
What you hiding under that trash bag?
Oh, I forgot to tell you about that. The big difference between my book and the state's book, and I gave the state an older copy of my roster years ago to help get them started. But the biggest difference between my book and their book is they don't list their sources. When you look in the book, if I started to bring it with me and just forgot it, but you look at it, it might say John Smith, Confederate Navy, enlisted from New Hanover County, such a date. They don't tell you where they got the information. Mine is all documented. And now, if I may, just for a minute, let me rearrange your stuff here. I've got a little something special I thought I would bring to show you. It's always nice to have show and tell. This is an original Civil War summer weight jumper. I had it tested by the lady who is the textile conservator for the state of North Carolina, and she told me, yep. I also had a man who is he's deceased now, unfortunately, but he was like the naval guy. If you want to know anything about old Navy stuff, you went to him. And when I saw this, I got this at the military show in Baltimore, and I went and asked him, if he had time, because he had a table set up, would he go and check this thing out for me? Well, he just got up immediately. He didn't really know me from Adam. Left his own table for 20 or 30 minutes. He studied this thing about this close for, I know, 20 minutes. And turned around to me and said, it's right. My wife, not only does she not know what I paid for this, she never will. That price goes to the grave with me. Because if she knew what I paid for this thing, I'd be in the grave. But as you can see, I'm sorry? Loose lips sink marriages too. But if you notice, people have asked me, is it Confederate or is it Union? Don't know. No way to tell. A lot of these things were sewed by guys on the ship or people in ports, It's a very thin material, so it's nice and cool during the summer. They all, Union Navy and Confederate Navy, had a blue denim collar and the blue cuffs. This could be Confederate. If it is, it's worth way more than I paid for it. But I just don't know. But if y'all want to come up and take a look at it, please feel free to do so. Well, here I'm making a mess. Oh, I can get it. It'll take a while, but I'll get it. Here we go. Yeah. But anyway, but if you have any other questions or anything, let me know.
How do you preserve it at home to where you can enjoy it, but at the same time keep it from deteriorating?
I keep it mostly in an air-conditioned environment, and I keep it usually covered with plastic bag or something. I wasn't in the Museum of History. I was in archives, but I did learn enough from the history people to know that you don't leave textiles somewhere where there's going to be a lot of change of temperature and humidity and all that stuff, and you don't leave it out in the sunlight because it'll ruin. But yeah, that's of all the stuff I've bought over the years. I'm a big military collector, uniforms and stuff. That's the best thing I ever found.
Have you ever tried it on?
Oh no, no. It would rip like it's very thin. If you want to come look at it, you look at it, but it's very thin. I mean, I literally, where is it? There's a little tiny hole in it somewhere that I punched in it by accident at another talk. No, well, I think that's just from, I can't see it now, but I had a sword. I was going to bring some naval cutlasses and all that, and I thought, no, the last time you did that, you poked a hole in your jumper, a little tiny hole. But maybe that's it. No, that's it right there. A split right in there. I like the dyed. I tried to slip my wrist, but the things were too dull. But anyway, that's all I got for you.
You do 5 drawings for us.
5 drawings. Yes, I will.
First one is going to be for the gift bag.
The gift bag. You want to read it? You want me to?
You go ahead.
All right.